Good afternoon. I'm Walt Bauer, and I'd like to welcome you to the Human Development Institute's third fall seminar. We welcome the participants who are joining us online through Zoom, as well as the participants who are here with us at the live presentation at the University of Kentucky. Our presenter will provide an opportunity for questions this afternoon, and we welcome questions from all of our participants. Please type your questions in the chat box if you are online. Should you have any questions about CEUs, you can contact me. Please take a moment at the conclusion of the seminar to complete our brief evaluation. The evaluation will be sent to your email address immediately after the seminar. It is really helpful as we plan for upcoming seminars. Now, to introduce today's speaker. Lori Gresham is the Clinical Program Manager Senior for the Department of Medicaid Services. Ms. Gresham has an extensive knowledge of all the Medicaid waivers, from waiver applications to regulations to the inner day-to-day processes. The title of the seminar is Medicaid Waivers 101. I'm now going to turn it over to our presenter.
Hello. As Walt said, I'm Lori Gresham. I am the Clinical Program Manager Senior for the 1915C waivers for the Department of Medicaid Services. I serve as Policy Advisor for the Commissioner's Office, and I'm overseeing the 1915C waiver redesign. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the current functions of the waivers, how to apply for a waiver, and what has happened so far in waiver redesign and some next steps. So I'll try to use this little clicker thing. So some background about Medicaid. Medicaid came into inception in 1965. At that time, services for long-term care supports were solely institutional based. In 1981, CMS recognized that it's better for people to age in their home and provide community-based services on a long-term basis as opposed to institutionalization. We've certainly come a long way from 1981, but still have a long way to go as well. So what is a waiver? What does that term mean? CMS defines waivers, or notes that waivers can allow states to waive certain parts of Medicaid requirements, hence the name waiver. Some of those would be income. So for instance, to be on regular Medicaid, it's I think 170% of the national poverty level. For waivers, it's roughly 300%. Statewide-ness, so you can target specific areas, like in Kentucky, maybe the Appalachian area, or target populations, which is what you see in Kentucky. We have waivers that are targeted for separate populations. There are some assurances that CMS requires states to make to offer these waivers. Some of the assurances states have to take into consideration is that within a waiver, we must provide the same care as the level of care that they would receive in an institution or need in an institution. So if we say, I'm going to take care of this person in the community, I have to be able to wrap services around them to take care of them in the waiver, or then it's not an appropriate waiver. We must also demonstrate that the community-based services are equal to or less than what it costs to house somebody in institutional care. States do receive a federal match. For waivers, it's roughly 70% federal dollars, 30% state dollars. So for every dollar that we spend, 70 of that comes from the federal government, 30 of it comes from your state's pocketbook. So you can understand why it's very important that we follow the federal rule, because they give us quite a bit of money. So states must also provide ongoing quality assurance for those waivers to demonstrate that the services rendered are rendered in the manner that we have received an approval for. So for each waiver that you see, there are several steps. The first is a waiver application that we send to Centers for Federal Medicaid. Big Medicaid is how I like to put it, because that's what it is. So we have to give them an application that says, here's what this waiver is going to do. In the state of Kentucky, our governing body are regulations. So we have a waiver application that's federal and state regulations. The federal government approves all of that based on both. So when they come and look at what we're doing, they look and say, are you doing what your waiver application and what your regulations say, because that's what we approved. And then if we don't do that, then they take our money. And we don't want that, because we use that money to go back. Okay, so let's look at the current state of waivers and what waivers look like today. In Kentucky, we have 6 1915C waivers. There's lots of different types of waivers. You all have heard, I'm sure, about the 1115 waiver. That's the other side of the house and doesn't affect folks who fall into this category, who fall into 1915Cs. Completely different waiver. A lot of times we hear folks, we'll go out and talk to individuals and they're terrified because they've heard they're taking away my waiver because there's some confusion because they say 1115 waiver. These are completely separate. So if you have that fear, you can take that away, because if you fall into a 1915C bucket, doesn't apply to you at all. You can just move on. But across the nation, there's 1915Is, 1915Js, 1915Bs, all kinds of different acronyms and letters. In the state of Kentucky, what we have for our home and community-based supports are 1915C waivers. Those are labeled by the federal government as home and community-based services waivers. Now, in Kentucky, we do have a waiver called the home and community-based waiver. So the home and community-based services is all of them. The home and community-based waiver is the actual waiver. And that the reason it's named that, it was our first waiver, and we were wildly creative in naming it. So as you can see here, we have the 6 different waivers, and we'll go a little more in detail about each one of those. We'll start with the acquired brain injury waiver. There are 2 acquired brain injury waivers. There's acquired brain injury and acquired brain injury long-term care. The acquired brain injury is for individuals who are typically acutely injured and require intensive services and supports to re-enter community life. That has kind of morphed as waivers have went along, and you can see the services that are listed there. I won't read them to you all, and you can see what is offered there. To qualify for this waiver, you obviously have to have an acquired brain injury, hence the name, be 18 or over, and all of our waivers require some sort of long-term care compatibility. So we tell CMS, without this waiver, this person would likely have to be institutionalized, and this is the type of institution they would have to utilize. For ABI, it is nursing facility level of care, and within that regulation, there are different intensities, and there's one that specifically talks to brain injury, and that's what we utilize. They are expected to be able to benefit from waiver services, or what would be the point? And then be financially eligible for Medicaid services, again, utilizing that waiver criteria, not regular Medicaid criteria. So all folks have to meet a long-term level of care, be financially eligible, and be expected to benefit from waiver services. Specifically targeted brain injury for this one. Next is brain injury long-term care. As the name notes, these are folks who we anticipate as an alternative to institutional care, they will need long-term supports that have kind of reached their plateau, maybe some small progress throughout their lifetime, but have pretty well maintained, need maintenance more so than rehabilitation. But they want to live safely in their community. Again, the individual has to have a primary diagnosis of brain injury, be Medicaid eligible, meet nursing facility level of care, and be 18 years or older. Okay, the next is our creatively named home and community-based waiver. This waiver targets individuals who are physically disabled or aged. And they have to meet nursing facility level of care. To fall into this bucket, when you look at what that requirement is it's somebody that has some sort of medical condition, whether it be high blood pressure, diabetes, and needs assistance with their activities of daily living. So walking, bathing, and grooming, eating, those sort of things. That's who falls into this bucket, or aged. The federal language for that is 65 years or older. So that's who meets this bucket. And again, meets nursing facility level of care and Medicaid eligible financially. The next is the Michelle P Waiver. This again is a home and community-based waiver, and this targets individuals who have developmental disabilities or significantly sub-average intellectual functioning. They must require a protective environment while learning, functional living skills, having educational experiences, self-supporting activities, and developing awareness of their environment. And also, again, must meet the financial requirements. A lot of folks know that this waiver came about because of SEL slots being full. The intent of this waiver initially, it was intended to mimic SEL without the residential piece, was the intent. As needs have changed throughout time, the folks who access this waiver have evolved throughout time. A lot of people coin this the autism waiver or the children's waiver. That's not what the waiver is. The waiver is to support anyone who falls into these types of eligibility. The next one that we'll look at is Model 2 waiver. This waiver is very different than any of our waivers. All of our other waivers are social in nature and not targeted at medical things. This is for folks who are dependent on a ventilator for 12 hours or greater a day. And as you can see, there's two services, respiratory therapy and skilled nursing. So obviously this is much more medical in nature, and that's why those folks are required for this. And they must meet hospital-based nursing facility, which is a whole different. What you think about these people are pathways, ventilator units is what these folks are. This is our smallest waiver with about 48 individuals, but they are some of our highest needs individuals. And lastly, we have the Supports for Community Living waiver, the SCL waiver. This again is for individuals who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. They must meet the requirements for residents in an ICF IID, and then meet Medicaid financial eligibility requirements. And again, you can see the services for those folks. And as we look at how waivers function, you can kind of remember that Michelle P and SCL both are similarly situated in the folks that they target. And in those, their requirements are ICF placement without waivers. And for Michelle P, it can also be nursing home. And then for the other waivers, it's nursing facility based on what their diagnosis is. And so that's when the federal government looks at our waivers, they look at how much it costs for that facility. So that's why you see differentiations between people will say, well, this group gets this giant budget, why do we not? And that's what drives those requirements for how much we can give a waiver, is those federal definitions say you can only give X number of dollars because that's the facility that they would utilize were they not utilizing waiver services.
So is there a difference between the ICF facility and a nursing home?
Absolutely. In funding and in services. So nursing facilities are largely based on rehabilitation, activities of daily living for discharge, and health. For ICFs, it is behavioral supports, the kind of supports that individuals with intellectual disabilities utilize. It's called an intermediate care facility for individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and those are specifically targeted. Additionally, they are much more expensive facilities to run, and that's why you'll see the higher dollars in SEL.
Like Like what Eastern State used to be? Is that-
No, it's like Hazelwood, Oakwood, Outwood, and those are the three that come to mind. I think we have 4 or 5 in the state, but those are the 3 that right
They're
off.
actually more expensive than nursing homes.
Correct. Nursing homes are not quite as expensive because they don't do the ancillary services that those folks do, and so they are. Now for Michelle P., if you'll remember, I told you there were 2 qualifications. It was either ICF or nursing facility. So that one, it's more of a balance between the 2, and if you're approved, it's based on which one of those you were approved under. So ICF has a much more stringent eligibility requirement than nursing facilities. So if you get in because of nursing facility, that's why you see that difference in the budgets.
On that side, you have for eligibility on the top, they have to have an intellectual and developmental disability, and on the bottom,
It's or. It's or.
It's or.
Yes. Thank you. We'll note that and change that. I'm glad somebody's reading them. So let's talk about HCB waiver, enrollment, and waitlist. And I don't know if I have a waitlist slide in here. Oh, I do. Good. So this is the enrollment process. I know you cannot read those little tiny things, so I'll basically walk you through what enrollment looks like. Currently, we utilize for enrollment into a waiver, you all may have heard of MWMA. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's what we have. And so currently, there is an integrated application that an individual can apply for both Medicaid and waiver at the same time, which is very new for the state of Kentucky. It's had its goods and its bads, I'll be honest, but that's the first step is your application. In that application, I'm not going to get into application about Medicaid eligibility. Not my wheelhouse, that's DCBS, and it has its faults, as we've heard across the state. But we'll talk about waiver applications since that's what we're here to discuss. So you go in, and really anybody can do a waiver application for you. The handout that Walt is giving you is a quick reference guide for how to do that for someone. An individual can do it themselves online. They can also go to the local ADRCs, the Adult Resource Centers, to assist in that. You can go to a AAA. A lot of case managers have set up to be application initiators, so they can help folks through that process. So there's all kinds of ways to get that accomplished. And if you're having trouble finding somebody to help you with that, send us an email, give us a call, and we'll help you find somebody. So once you have your application done, in that application, it asks you what we call gatepost questions. For instance, do you have a physical disability? Do you have an intellectual disability? Do you have an acquired brain injury? Obviously, or are you ventilator dependent for 12 hours? And hearing what the eligibility requirements are for the waivers, you understand why we ask those questions. Based on the answers to those questions, it'll ask you more questions. So, for instance, do you have a physical disability? Yes. Please explain your disability. And then it just gives you the opportunity to kind of paint a picture so that when that comes to us, we know which waiver to send it to. Now, if somebody goes in and does that and puts none of those, that they don't have any of those, then they don't meet pre-screening requirements. Obviously, you know, we're not going to push that somewhere if nothing's indicated that you need assistance. And with each targeting criteria so for physical disability, the required form for that by regulation is what's called a MAP 10. That's something a doctor signs that says without these waivers, this person would likely be institutionalized, and here's their diagnosis and their ICD-10 codes. That then is routed, and for someone with an intellectual disability, it is a functional analysis, a psychological eval, and there's something else, and I can't remember what it is, but there's very specific criteria, and those are all guided by the regulations. Because like I said, if we've told CMS we're going to do it, we have to do it, or they come back and say, why didn't you do that? And then once that application is full and filled out, it is then sent to one of what's called our capacity reviewers. For the waivers that have wait list, if the person is applicable for that waiver, then they are placed on the wait list. That capacity reviewer also looks at their application and says, yeah, we're going to put them on, say, for instance, the Michelle P wait list, but we do see that they may have targeting criteria that makes them possibly eligible for the home and community-based waiver. So they will then also route that application to the home and community-based waiver. Prior to this system, even with all its faults, we didn't have that capability. Prior to this system, if you were waitlisted for Michelle P, that's where you went, and that was it. So this is really a step in the right direction for us. We're really excited about this. And the capacity reviewers are real-time folks. It's clinicians. It's folks that know about waivers. It's not somebody sitting off in a tower that's just, it's our folks. So once it gets to capacity reviewer, if there's a spot in that waiver, they will do what's called reserving capacity. What that means is they'll hold that spot so they can attempt to set up an assessment to come out and see you and assess you for functionality and appropriateness for the waivers. Now, again, we've told CMS we will hold this many slots. This is all the slots we have. And that's based, again, on budget neutrality, which is that nursing facility number of care. And basically what the legislators say, here's the amount of money you get for this waiver, okay? And so then we kind of divvy that up to the slots. So we tell CMS this is how many slots we'll have. If there's more people that are accessing services than that, then we create a wait list, as you've seen for Michelle P, SCL, and ABI Acute, I believe, ABI Long-Term Care has the wait list. So if there's a wait list, you're put on that and then routed. So let's pretend that this person going through this is going to HCB, because there's no wait list there. So the capacity is reserved for HCB. A task through the MWMA system that I talked about is sent to an assessor. In HCB, there's independent assessors, and each waiver is assessed differently. So the assessor then contacts the individual based on the numbers that we have in our system, contacts them and sets up an assessment. Federal requirement is that you cannot be assessed if you are in an institution. The reason for that is because it's a community-based service. If it's a community-based service, it can't be given while in the institution. Federal requirement, and a lot of people don't, well, why can't you just come to the hospital and assess my child? Because the feds won't pay for that. And remember, they give me 70 cents on my dollar, and quite honestly, the state doesn't have the 70 cents to get Medicaid in every state is right at their budgets. So the assessor comes out and assesses you and sends that through and sets that up. If it is for one of the agencies where the individual can choose their assessor, like I think for Michelle P has the CMHCs, ABI, the case manager, currently does that assessment. So if you're selecting a case manager, you could choose that. That's what that orange box says. So then you go, the purple box is the LOC assessment. The dark blue box is the assessment reviewer. Once the assessments come in, it goes to what's called our QIO. It's a contracted entity that is separate from us, that is separate from providers, so that it is independent without Medicaid saying we have too many people, don't approve them, they're too much. It's looking at that assessment independently and saying whether they meet the regulatory criteria for that waiver. So they review that. If LOC is not met, you can request a secondary review of that by somebody other than the first reviewer. So then we go to, if LOC is not met, then they send you a letter and say LOC is not met, and you have ways to appeal that. So let's pretend this person's LOC was met. Yes, Walt has a question.
We have a question from online. The question's from Lauren. Are there any plans to change the assessment process for children versus adults?
So we'll talk a little more about waiver redesign later. and I'll make sure to address that specifically. So the gray box is the next step, and that's to pick a case manager. Once you've had your LOC assessment and your LOC has been met, then you have to pick a case manager. Currently, all case managers are now conflict-free case managers. What that means is that that person is supposed to be free from coercion or pushing by the providers. It used to be that the same people did the assessment, the same people developed the plan of care, the same people then delivered those services. You can see the conflict there that says, well, I want this amount of dollars, and so I'm going to say this on the assessment. HCB is the first waiver that we have went to that really has conflict-free assessment, case management, and from services. And we've really, I was honestly quite surprised when that came about. I thought that that was the waiver with the little old ladies, and it was, there wasn't fraud in that waiver. I was sadly mistaken. We have seen a lot of individuals who, when I look at the assessment that is now done by somebody independent, it is vastly different from the assessment that is done by an independent entity. And an example that I have seen is our assessor drove up to the house, and the gentleman was digging a ditch in the front yard with a shovel, a big shovel. And when I say a ditch, I'm not talking like to plant flowers. I'm talking a drainage ditch to put a pipe in. Big ditch. He runs in the house when state car pulls up, runs in the house, shuts the door. She knocks on the door, comes in, and they're doing their assessment. One of the questions is, do you need assistance with ambulation? And he came to the door in a wheelchair, and he said, no, I'm confined to my wheelchair. The assessor says, you do know, I saw you in the yard, right? Oh yeah, but my case manager said I had to say that to get my services. And so those are kind of the things that we see. Now, are all folks like that? Absolutely not. Nor do we believe that that is the vast majority. But we do need to protect against that, and the feds have seen that even on a federal level, and that's why they mandated conflict-free case management to get to that point. So the next is the light blue, and that's where your case manager initiates your plan of care. In that meeting, it's supposed to be where the individual who is receiving their service and the team that they choose. So if they want nobody in the room but them, their case manager, and service providers, then that's all that has to be there. If they want, and this is not withholding guardians, because guardians in the state of Kentucky, if you're appointed a guardian, then that person is your stand-in. Now, we do still anticipate that folks will speak to the individual receiving services, whether they have a guardian or not, but the state understands what guardianship is. And so in that, the case manager is supposed to speak to the individual and develop a plan of care based on the individual's needs that are pulled from that assessment, and talking to them about, you know, what services they'd like and the things that they would like to do in the community, and look at that and give them a choice of providers. So saying, here's the providers in the area, especially for that initial plan of care, because you don't know who the providers are, so you don't know, you know, what you want. And so kind of working through that. Final rule, which some of you may have heard of or not, that's a federal guideline, also requires that we look at non-waiver specific services. So does that person want to, or their guardian want them to work in a non-disability specific setting? So then talking to them about, okay, well, how do we get there? Because the reality of it is that they may need some training to get there. So setting up looking at their life on a continuum and saying, I want to get to point A. How do we get you to point A? There may be point Z, R, and T in between getting you to point A. So looking at that and setting up goals and objectives and services to obtain that goal. The dark, I guess that's black, I can't really tell. The second to last is the plan reviewer then reviews that plan of care. Again, it goes to that outside independent entity, the QIO, that's CareWise, to look at that, and then they prior authorize those services. And that's a whole other process, and if you want to talk about that, we can. The last is reassessment. So annually, for both Medicaid eligibility and waiver, the federal government says you have to be relooked at every year. Medicaid eligibility is separate from waiver eligibility, and that's where some folks get confused is, well, I just told them what I can and can't do. That's separate from taking your paperwork down to the DCBS office and providing them bank statements and all the 9 million papers that they require you to have. So those are separate, but the federal government requires that every year you have those reassessments of financial eligibility and functionality. So that's how you get through the process. That's what that beautiful graphic is. So the next, the slide will say, please see the handout. And we've kind of talked about it a little bit. And from the feel that I get in the room, and I can't get it to turn until I use this. Hey, Walt, it's not moving.
It's not moving?
No. Oh, I know why. I know. Well, no, it should still go to the next, to this one. From the feel in the room and from kind of what I'm gathering by the question is that most of you, I won't walk through this as a group. This is the quick reference guide to applying for waivers. I kind of get the feel that most people understand what waivers are and either are providers of waivers or are already on waivers. At the end, if somebody wants me to walk through this with them, I will be happy to do so. But that's kind of, I won't bore you with that. You all have the handout and the folks online are able to download that.